Hi, welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew, where I answer film-related questions submitted by members of the BMFI community. Today's question is, I recently watched Babyface, a Barbara Stanwyck film from 1933. A friend of mine said this was a pre-code film, before the Hays Office. What did she mean? Well, this question has to do with film censorship and film content regulations going back to issues throughout the 1920s that culminated in the early 1930s. And the two particular terms referenced in the question, pre-code, refers the code in that is the Production Code Administration, the industry's, the American film industry's self-censorship regime that would be implemented in earnest in 1934. And Hays Office refers to the generally to the Office of the Mechanism for Enforcement of that code that was actually run by a man named Joseph Breen, who was originally from Philadelphia, as it turns out, and not by Hays, although it has the name Hays because Will Hays, a former Postmaster General of the United States, was the head of the motion picture industry group at the time that this debate over film content and these ultimate rules of self-censorship were implemented, even though Hays himself didn't end up implementing the code or monitoring it or evaluating films for their appropriateness with regard to it, etc. Hays was the first person who was brought in by the studios to help sort of get a handle on the film industry's sort of public reputation and behavior, as the industry seemed to be scandal-plagued throughout the 20s. And following the model of Major League Baseball, who brought in Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis, they wanted to get their own sort of commissioner who was hired by the people he was supposed to govern. So it's always a bit of a sort of tricky dynamic there. But nevertheless, Hays was given the charge of sort of improving the public image and setting and maintaining standards of decency for the American film industry. Among other things, Hays was the one who, well before the code was implemented, banned Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle from American screens for something going on a decade in the 20s and early 30s because of a scandal that followed him related to the accusation, eventually proven overwhelmingly proven to be false, but the accusation that he had sexually assaulted a young would-be starlet. It led to him being banned by Hays from Hollywood screens for many years. And this was a star who was at his peak almost as popular as Chaplin, sort of maybe perhaps even sort of on par with Chaplin, although their careers didn't exactly peak at the same time, so that was a big deal. But anyway, because of that scandal and a host of other scandals, the movie industry was coming under fire from a host of social and religious groups, not the least of which was the Catholic Church, who found much of what the motion picture industry was doing and releasing to be sort of morally reprehensible. And they wanted the film industry to clean up its act, and they had ideas for how that would work. And actually there were members of the Catholic Church, both clergy and laymen, who had been working with the film industry as consultants on a host of other things, including religious pictures, and generally sort of trying to get buy-in from one of the country's largest and most powerful religious organizations at the time. And it's more than a religious organization at the time. Of course, it's also, I think it's fair to say, a sort of cultural organization for a lot of people and in a lot of areas of the country. In any case, they wanted the film industry to clean up its act, and they suggested a set of rules that would make them happy and would perhaps be something the industry could live with. In the very early 1930s, the industry said, thank you very much. We appreciate the rules and the guidelines, and we plan to follow them. and they took the rules and guidelines and put them in a drawer, and that was that. But they had agreed. They said they agreed to follow these rules of decency. So that actually, to some minds within the film industry, gave them a bit of a fig leaf of protection or immunity from social pressure that had been applied on them because of the content of their films. And so many people call the period from roughly 1930-31 until 1934 the pre-code period, because it's this window where the film industry had agreed to follow the sort of content and moral rules of what would appear in a motion picture and other materials, you know, created by the industry, but hadn't yet started actually enforcing those rules. Keep in mind, it's not like they planned to enforce those rules at a later date. They planned not to, in fact. So once they agreed to the terms, at least in theory, they felt they could function with, I won't say impunity, but being just as bold, if not bolder than they were before. And so you find a lot of American movies during this time that are even more risque than the ones Hollywood had been putting out a few years earlier. During this period of basically 30 to 34, you have movies like Babyface, about a woman from terrible circumstances who essentially sleeps her way to the top, which was frowned upon for a host of reasons at that time. During this time, you see the rise and enormous popularity of Mae West. You see the most ambitious and violent of the gangster films. You see the release of a version, or the production of a version of King Kong that is fraught with, for that time, scandalous sexuality and things that were seen to be racially inflammatory. So across the board during this time, you have Hollywood really pushing the envelope in terms of content and morality of its films, because again, they felt they could, because they had agreed to these rules even though they weren't enforcing them. Well, the Catholic Church, which was the leader of this effort, though not the only group certainly that was concerned, said, we see what you're doing, and if you thought we put pressure on you before with different cardinals and different archdioceses pressuring movies to be banned and cut in different cities and states around the country, you ain't seen nothing yet. So you better start following our code, and here's how you will do it. You will let this man, Joseph Breen, who has worked in the industry and has great respect for motion pictures, but is also a faithful Catholic, enforce it. And basically that's what started occurring in 1934. So Breen, for almost the entirety of the next 20 years, had ultimate say-so over everything that appeared on a Hollywood screen. And it's a fascinating story, and it's far more nuanced and detailed than what I've gone into here. I've actually taught a whole course on this on pre-code cinema, and there's a number of wonderful books out there on the topic. But when someone says they're talking about a pre-code movie, or a movie that, I don't know how that got by the Hays office, you might hear somebody say, that's basically what they're talking about. So I hope that gives some introduction to the topic, though as I said, it's a really interesting topic, and there's a lot more to discuss on it. If you have a film-related question you would like me to try to answer, please visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and use the Ask Andrew form to submit it. Who knows? Next time, maybe I'll be answering your question.